HOA kept dumping snow on my land, so I built an ice wall that shut down their street. Before we dive into today's story, I'd love to know where you're watching from. Drop the name of your city, state, or country in the comments below. I always enjoy seeing where everyone is tuning in from. Thank you for being here. Now, let me take you back to the day this unbelievable story began. The strange thing about snow is that it never lies. It always remembers where someone put it. By the end of that winter, every person on my street would learn exactly what those words meant. My name is Ethan Walker, and for nearly 12 years I believed I had found the quiet life my father always wanted for our family. My house sat on the edge of a small mountain community in Colorado, where pine trees framed the horizon. Mornings smelled like fresh cedar and cold air, and the first snowfall of the season usually brought neighbors outside with mugs of hot coffee instead of arguments. That illusion shattered before sunrise on a bitter January morning when the deep growl of a snowplow ripped through the silence outside my bedroom window. At first I thought it was just another county truck clearing the road after the overnight storm, but then I heard something different. The metallic scrape slowed. The engine revved harder. Seconds later came the heavy, unmistakable thud of thousands of pounds of packed snow crashing onto my property. I pulled on my boots, grabbed my coat, and stepped into the freezing darkness. My breath instantly turned into white clouds as the icy wind cut across my face. The smell of diesel exhaust lingered in the air while the flashing amber lights of the snowplow disappeared down the street without slowing once. Standing in front of me was a mountain of snow stretching nearly the entire width of my front yard. The pile towered over my pickup, blocked half my driveway, buried my mailbox, and leaned against the fence my father and I had built together years earlier. I didn't need a survey marker to know where the property line was. Every inch of that frozen wall belonged somewhere else before someone deliberately pushed it onto my land. At first I assumed it had been an honest mistake. Winter storms create chaos, and snow crews work long nights under impossible conditions. I spent 4 exhausting hours digging a narrow path wide enough to reach my garage, telling myself it probably wouldn't happen again. But the next storm came 3 days later. So did the same truck. So did the same engine. And once again, the entire load landed on my property instead of being hauled away. By the third storm, I stopped believing in coincidences. Every snowfall followed the same pattern with almost mechanical precision. The HOA's contractor would clear the private streets before dawn, drive straight toward the entrance to my lot, angle the plow blade just enough, and dump another massive ridge of snow onto my side of the property line before driving away as if nothing unusual had happened. My yard slowly became their unofficial dumping ground, saving them time, fuel, and disposal costs while leaving me to deal with the consequences. When I called the HOA office, I received polite promises. When I emailed photographs, I received polite silence. When I finally spoke with HOA President Linda Whitmore in person, she looked past the towering piles behind me, smiled with complete confidence, and said, "Mr. Walker, it's only snow. It'll melt." She said those 4 words as though they settled everything. Maybe they did in her mind. They certainly stayed in mine. Because what Linda failed to understand was that snow never simply disappears. It changes. It melts. It flows. It freezes again. And every one of those changes follows rules that no HOA board can vote away. I drove back into my garage that afternoon, brushed the ice crystals from my jacket, opened an old notebook my father once used on construction projects, and quietly wrote down the date, the weather, the temperature, and the exact location of every pile they had dumped. I never raised my voice. I never threatened anyone. I simply started paying attention, because experience had taught me something far more valuable than anger ever could. Nature keeps perfect records, and sooner or later, it always collects every debt. The next storm arrived on a Friday evening, and by then I had already changed my routine. Instead of watching the weather forecast to see how much snow we might get, I watched it to predict how much would end up in my front yard. Around midnight, the wind began rattling the windows, carrying tiny ice crystals that tapped against the glass like handfuls of sand. By sunrise, nearly 10 inches of fresh powder covered the neighborhood, softening every rooftop and muffling every sound except one. Right on schedule, I heard the distant rumble of the same snowplow climbing the hill toward our subdivision. I did not rush outside this time. Instead, I stood behind the front window with a cup of black coffee, watching through the frosted glass as the flashing amber lights reflected across the untouched snow. The truck slowed exactly where I expected. The driver angled the blade. Another enormous wave of snow rolled across the property line and settled on my land with a deep, heavy crunch. Then the truck continued down the street as if it had completed another perfectly ordinary task. I waited until it disappeared before stepping outside with my phone. The air was so cold that every breath stung my lungs. My boots sank nearly to my ankles while the snow squeaked beneath each step, a sound only dry mountain snow can make when the temperature falls well below freezing. I photographed everything from every angle. The fence posts, the buried landscaping stones, the property markers, the tire tracks, even the direction of the plow marks. Then I measured the height of the pile with a tape measure I normally used for construction projects. 6 feet and 4 inches. I wrote the number beside the date in the notebook my father had left me. Some people collect receipts. I collected patterns. Monday morning, I visited the county records office and requested copies of the subdivision plat, the drainage easements, and the original grading plans filed decades earlier. The clerk recognized the neighborhood immediately and smiled politely as she slid the rolled drawings across the counter. Back home, I spread every document across my dining room table. My engineering background had taught me that land always tells the truth if you know how to read it. Elevation lines, drainage arrows, retaining slopes, and runoff channels formed a story far more honest than any conversation I had ever had with the HOA board. After several hours, I noticed something that immediately caught my attention. My property sat only a few feet lower than the main roadway, but the natural drainage had originally been designed to carry melting snow away from every home through a shallow swale running behind the lots. Years earlier, during a landscaping project approved by the HOA, that swale had been partially filled to create a decorative green space. Ever since then, the easiest place for snow removal crews to dump excess snow had become my front yard. They had turned my property into the neighborhood's unofficial storage area simply because it was convenient. That evening, I attended the monthly HOA meeting, carrying nothing more than a folder containing photographs and county maps. Linda Whitmore greeted homeowners with the same practiced smile she always wore, thanking everyone for supporting the community. When the meeting opened for comments, I calmly explained what I had documented over the previous 3 storms. I placed several photographs on the table and pointed out the property markers visible beneath the snow. Linda barely glanced at them before leaning back in her chair. She said the contractor had assured the board that all snow removal complied with community standards. Another board member added that everyone had to make small sacrifices during winter. A few neighbors quietly looked away while others avoided eye contact entirely. Nobody argued with me, but nobody supported me either. I gathered my papers, thanked them for their time, and walked out without another word. As I reached my truck, an older neighbor named Harold stepped beside me. He lowered his voice almost to a whisper and said, "You are not the first person this has happened to. You are just the first one keeping records." Those words stayed with me all the way home. I realized I was no longer dealing with a single frustrating winter inconvenience. I was looking at a habit that had quietly existed for years because everyone assumed challenging it would cost more than accepting it. That was the moment I stopped thinking about the next snowfall and started thinking about the spring thaw, because snow is only temporary, but water always finishes the journey that gravity begins. Over the next 2 weeks, I stopped reacting like a frustrated homeowner and started thinking like the engineer my father had trained me to become. Every snowfall added another page to my notebook, and every page revealed another piece of the same story. I recorded temperatures before sunrise, measured the depth of every pile, photographed the direction of the plow marks, and compared them with the county grading maps spread across my dining room table every evening. What surprised me was not that the contractor kept dumping snow onto my property. What surprised me was how predictable the entire operation had become. They always arrived between 5:30 and 6:15 in the morning. They always approached from the same direction. They always angled the blade at almost exactly the same point in the road. They were not making quick decisions in difficult weather. They were following a routine that had become second nature. One afternoon, I drove through the neighborhood after another storm and noticed something I had completely missed before. Every intersection was clean. Every mailbox along the main entrance remained perfectly accessible. The clubhouse parking lot looked almost spotless. Meanwhile, My yard had become the only place where excess snow reached heights that no ordinary residential property should ever experience. Convenience had quietly become policy. The more I looked, the clearer the pattern became. I began speaking with a few longtime residents without mentioning my own situation first. Harold was not the only one who remembered similar problems. An elderly couple 2 streets away told me they had complained years earlier after runoff from melting snow flooded part of their landscaping. Another homeowner remembered replacing sections of a wooden fence after repeated snow piles had warped the boards every winter. None of them had taken the matter beyond a complaint because each incident seemed too small on its own. Nobody had connected them together. That realization changed everything. A collection of isolated inconveniences suddenly looked like years of systematic cost-cutting. Instead of transporting excess snow to approved disposal areas, the contractor simply pushed it wherever it was easiest, and the HOA accepted the results because the invoices stayed low and the roads looked clean. Late one afternoon, I walked the edge of my property carrying nothing more than a survey tape, a measuring wheel, and several bright marking flags. The ground beneath the snow followed a gentle slope that most people would never notice, but I could feel it with every careful step. My father used to tell me that water obeys mathematics with more discipline than people ever will. Standing there in the cold, I finally understood exactly what he meant. Snow might appear motionless for weeks, but every frozen pile represented thousands of gallons of future runoff waiting for warmer temperatures. The location where that snow rested today would determine where every drop of water traveled tomorrow. I returned home and opened decades of weather records for our county. Most winters followed the same rhythm. Heavy snowfall through January and February, followed by several warm afternoons in early March before nighttime temperatures dropped below freezing again. Those freeze and thaw cycles were powerful enough to reshape roads, crack sidewalks, and create dangerous sheets of ice almost overnight. Nature followed the same schedule every year, whether anyone noticed or not. The next morning, I visited the county engineering office again, this time asking about residential retaining structures, drainage improvements, and permit requirements. The engineer behind the counter patiently explained setback rules, grading limits, and acceptable materials. Nothing in the regulations prohibited a homeowner from protecting private property against erosion or redirecting runoff back toward its natural drainage path, provided the work remained entirely within the owner's property and complied with county code. I thanked him, collected copies of the guidelines, and drove home with something far more valuable than a plan. I now had certainty. Everything I had considered could be done legally if designed correctly. That evening, as another light snow began falling outside my kitchen window, I unfolded fresh graph paper across the table beside my father's old notebook. I sharpened a pencil, marked my property boundaries, calculated elevations inch by inch, and began sketching a modest retaining feature that looked completely ordinary on paper. To anyone else, it would appear to be nothing more than a practical improvement designed to protect my yard from repeated dumping. But hidden within those careful measurements was a simple truth that Linda Whitmore had never considered. She believed winter ended when the snowplows finished their routes. I knew winter was only setting the stage for everything that happened after the snow began to melt. The permit application took less than 20 minutes to complete, yet I spent almost an entire week preparing every detail before I submitted it. I refused to leave anything open to interpretation because I knew exactly how this would look if anyone decided to question my intentions later. Every measurement matched the county survey. Every elevation was calculated twice. Every drainage note referenced the existing grading plan. By the time I walked into the county office, the folder under my arm contained photographs, property maps, engineering sketches, and enough documentation to answer questions that nobody had even asked yet. The permit reviewer looked over the plans for several minutes before nodding with quiet approval. He explained that a low retaining structure designed to protect private property from repeated snow accumulation and seasonal runoff was perfectly reasonable as long as it remained entirely inside my property line and did not interfere with the public roadway or neighboring lots. That was exactly what my drawings showed. A few days later, the approval arrived in the mail. I placed the permit inside a waterproof folder and set it beside my father's old notebook. Both documents represented something Linda Whitmore seemed to underestimate. Paperwork often moves slower than emotion, but it usually wins in the end. Construction began the following Saturday under a bright blue sky that made the snow almost painfully white. The air smelled clean with just a faint hint of pine carried down from the hills. I marked the approved layout with bright orange stakes and string before bringing in compacted gravel, natural stone blocks, and drainage fabric. Anyone driving past would have seen nothing extraordinary. It looked like an ordinary landscaping project that many homeowners eventually complete after years of erosion. Several neighbors slowed their vehicles to watch for a few seconds before continuing down the road. Nobody stopped to ask questions. Around noon, Harold wandered over carrying 2 cups of coffee. He studied the stakes, looked at the rolled engineering plans resting on the tailgate of my truck, and smiled. He did not ask whether I was building something against the HOA. Instead, he asked whether the drainage calculations were difficult. I laughed and told him the calculations were easy. Convincing people to respect gravity was always the difficult part. We stood there for a few minutes listening to the distant sound of another snowplow clearing the upper entrance to the subdivision. Harold quietly shook his head before walking home. As the retaining structure slowly took shape over the next several days, I paid just as much attention to what happened beyond my property as I did to the work itself. The contractor continued dumping fresh snow into the exact same location, apparently assuming my project would simply disappear beneath the growing piles. In reality, every new load settled exactly where I expected it to. The retaining wall never crossed the property line. It never blocked traffic. It never touched HOA property. It simply protected the edge of my land while guiding future runoff back toward the natural drainage corridor identified on the original county plans decades earlier. That small distinction mattered more than anyone outside the engineering profession might realize. I was not redirecting water onto someone else's property. I was restoring the path the landscape had always intended to use before years of careless snow disposal disrupted it. A week later, Linda Whitmore finally drove past while I was spreading crushed stone behind the completed wall. She slowed her sport utility vehicle, lowered the window, and glanced across the project with obvious curiosity. Her expression quickly shifted into the confident smile I had seen at every HOA meeting. She asked whether I had finally decided to solve my snow problem. I smiled politely and replied that I was simply protecting my property in accordance with my approved county permit. She looked at the permit displayed inside a clear weatherproof holder near the work area, gave a small shrug, and wished me good luck before driving away. The conversation lasted less than a minute, yet I could not help noticing that she never once asked why the wall followed that particular alignment or why the drainage stone disappeared beneath the snow at such carefully calculated elevations. She saw rocks, gravel, and a homeowner trying to keep his yard clean. I saw a complete system waiting patiently for temperatures to rise above freezing. By the final week of February, the snowbanks across the neighborhood had grown taller than many fences, and my property held more frozen weight than ever before. Every fresh storm added another layer to the massive white ridge resting safely behind the retaining structure. Most people looked at those towering piles and saw nothing but another long winter. I looked at the afternoon forecast predicting the first stretch of warmer weather in weeks, followed immediately by overnight temperatures well below freezing, and quietly closed my notebook. The final piece of the pattern had finally arrived, and from that moment forward I knew I would not have to prove anything myself because nature was about to begin presenting the evidence 1 degree at a time. The first warm afternoon arrived so quietly that most people treated it as a welcome break from winter instead of the beginning of something much larger. Bright sunlight reflected across the snow with an almost blinding glare, forcing me to lower the brim of my cap every time I stepped outside. The air carried that unmistakable smell of damp earth waking beneath months of frozen ground, while tiny streams of meltwater trickled beneath the thick snowpack with a gentle sound that most people never notice unless they stop and listen. I stood beside the retaining wall with my notebook tucked under one arm, watching the first narrow ribbons of water emerge exactly where my calculations predicted they would. Nothing dramatic happened. That was the beautiful part. Nature never performs for an audience. It simply follows the path created by gravity and time. Throughout the afternoon, the piles that the contractor had pushed onto my property began shrinking almost imperceptibly. Every gallon of melting snow filtered through the drainage stone behind the retaining wall before entering the original runoff corridor shown on county maps decades earlier. I checked each outlet, photographed every flow pattern, and compared them against my engineering sketches. Everything behaved exactly as designed. My property remained dry, my foundation stayed protected, and the runoff followed the same natural direction it would have taken before years of careless snow dumping changed the landscape. Across the neighborhood, however, I noticed something different. Water began collecting along sections of the private roadway where it had rarely appeared before. The decorative landscaping that the HOA had installed years earlier still interrupted the original drainage swale, leaving shallow areas where meltwater slowed instead of continuing downhill. During the afternoon, the pavement simply looked wet. By sunset, the temperature had already started falling again. The Weather Service predicted that overnight conditions would drop well below freezing, creating the first hard refreeze of the season after several hours of rapid melting. I did not need a forecast to understand what that meant. I had already written the same pattern into my notebook after reviewing 20 years of local weather records. Around dusk, Harold walked over carrying his heavy winter coat across one arm instead of wearing it. He looked at the steady stream of water disappearing through the drainage stone and asked whether everything was working the way I expected. I smiled and nodded. He watched silently for another minute before looking toward the entrance road where long ribbons of standing water reflected the orange glow of the setting sun. He did not say anything else because he understood enough to reach the same conclusion I had. Neither of us caused the water to exist. Winter had already created it. The only question was where it would spend the night once the temperature dropped. After dark, I made one final walk around the property with a flashlight. The crisp evening air had returned, carrying the clean scent of pine mixed with the faint smell of wet asphalt cooling beneath a clear sky. Every drainage outlet remained open. The retaining wall held perfectly. My yard looked cleaner than it had at any point since the first storm of the season, despite holding weeks of accumulated snow only days earlier. Before going inside, I glanced toward the neighborhood road one last time. Thin sheets of water still rested across several low sections of pavement, perfectly calm beneath the moonlight. I closed my garage door, placed my notebook beside the kitchen window, and went to bed without setting an alarm. I did not need to wake early to make anything happen because my work was already finished. Long before sunrise, I was awakened by an unfamiliar sound echoing through the cold morning air. It was not the steady rumble of a snowplow or the scrape of metal against packed snow that had become part of my weekly routine. Instead, I heard the repeated spinning of tires searching for traction, followed by short bursts of engines stopping and starting somewhere near the neighborhood entrance. I stepped outside just as the first rays of sunlight reached the tops of the pine trees. The overnight freeze had transformed every shallow stream of meltwater into broad sheets of crystal-clear ice stretching across sections of the private roadway. Morning light reflected from the frozen surface like polished glass. Cars approached slowly before stopping. Delivery vans turned around. Residents climbed carefully from their vehicles, looking down in confusion at the unexpected ice beneath their feet. I stood quietly beside my fence, taking in the scene without saying a word. Everything unfolding before me had begun weeks earlier with one simple decision repeated over and over again by people who believed that moving a problem onto someone else's property meant the problem had disappeared. Now, for the first time all winter, the consequences had returned to the exact place where they truly belonged. By 7 o'clock that morning, the quiet neighborhood no longer sounded like a peaceful mountain community. Instead of birds and snow shovels, the air filled with the dull hum of idling engines, the soft scrape of boots against frozen pavement, and the occasional frustrated sound of tires spinning briefly before drivers wisely gave up trying to move. I poured myself a cup of coffee and stood near the front window for a few moments, watching the early sunlight turn the roadway into what looked like a sheet of polished crystal. From a distance, it was almost beautiful. Up close, it was obvious that nobody wanted to drive across it. The private street had not disappeared beneath a blizzard. It had simply become exactly what physics said it would become after thousands of gallons of meltwater settled overnight and temperatures dropped back below freezing. Around half an hour later, I heard another familiar sound. Linda Whitmore's sport utility vehicle slowly approached the entrance before coming to a careful stop. She stepped outside, wrapped tightly in a heavy winter coat, and stared at the broad stretch of ice with an expression that looked far different from the confident smile she usually carried into HOA meetings. Several board members soon arrived on foot, gathering near the frozen section of roadway, while the snow removal contractor parked his truck a short distance away. Their conversation was too far away for me to hear clearly, but I did not need to hear every word to understand the situation. Everyone was searching for a cause. Everyone believed something unusual had happened overnight. Nobody seemed willing to ask why so much melting snow had been sitting there in the first place. Less than an hour later, maintenance crews spread bags of ice melt across the pavement, while another vehicle carefully applied sand to improve traction. Residents slowly walked around the work area carrying grocery bags, backpacks, and travel mugs as they made their way toward vehicles parked on sections of dry pavement farther down the street. Delivery drivers waited patiently until conditions improved before continuing their routes. Fortunately, nobody appeared injured, but the disruption was impossible to ignore. What had once been dismissed as a harmless pile of snow on my property had now become a neighborhood problem that required time, labor, equipment, and emergency maintenance to address. Shortly before noon, my doorbell rang. When I opened the door, Linda stood on the porch accompanied by another HOA board member. She remained polite, although the confidence in her voice had noticeably softened. She explained that the board wanted to understand whether my recently completed drainage project might somehow be related to the unusual ice conditions on the private roadway. I invited them to stand beside the retaining wall while I retrieved the waterproof folder containing my approved county permit, grading plans, photographs, and inspection notes. We spent nearly 20 minutes reviewing the documents together. I showed them the original subdivision drainage drawings, the county approval for the retaining structure, the survey confirming every portion of the project remained inside my property boundaries, and the dated photographs documenting each snow pile deposited onto my land throughout the winter. Linda quietly turned each page without interrupting. When she reached the photographs showing repeated dumping along the property line, she paused for several seconds before asking whether I believed the contractor had created all those piles intentionally. I answered honestly. I told her I did not know what the contractor intended. I only knew where the snow had been placed and where gravity naturally carried the resulting water once temperatures increased. Those were facts supported by photographs, measurements, weather records, and county engineering plans rather than opinions. She looked back toward the roadway, now covered with melting ice treatment, before closing the folder and thanking me for my time. As they walked away, I noticed something that had not happened once during the entire winter. Neither Linda nor the other board member looked toward my retaining wall again. Instead, they spent several minutes examining the decorative landscaped area beside the road where the original drainage swale had been partially filled years earlier. For the first time since the season began, their attention shifted away from my property and toward the decisions that had quietly reshaped the neighborhood long before I ever built a single row of stone. Watching them from my front porch, I realized the conversation had finally changed. The question was no longer why I had protected my land. The real question had become why the neighborhood had been creating the same problem for years without recognizing where it truly began. The following morning, the neighborhood felt different in a way that had nothing to do with the weather. The ice had mostly disappeared after maintenance crews worked through the afternoon, but the conversations it created had only grown louder. Neighbors who usually waved from a distance now stopped at their mailboxes, speaking in quiet groups while glancing toward the entrance road and then toward the landscaped area beside it. For the first time since winter began, people were asking questions instead of making excuses. Around 10 o'clock, a white county pickup truck pulled into the subdivision, followed by another vehicle marked with the Public Works Department. Two engineers stepped out carrying clipboards, measuring wheels, and survey equipment. They were not responding to an emergency. They were responding to repeated reports requesting an evaluation of drainage conditions after the unexpected refreeze. I watched from my porch as they carefully walked the roadway, measured elevations, inspected stormwater paths, and compared existing grades against digital maps displayed on a tablet. Their inspection looked remarkably similar to the work I had been doing for weeks, only now it carried official authority. Shortly afterward, one of the engineers approached my driveway after noticing the retaining structure near the property line. He introduced himself, explained why they were there, and politely asked whether I would be willing to show him the permit documentation for my project. I invited him inside, spread my drawings, photographs, weather notes, and county approvals across the dining room table, and answered every question he asked. The conversation lasted nearly 45 minutes. Instead of defending my work, I simply explained the sequence of events exactly as it had happened. I showed him dated photographs of every snow pile deposited onto my property, measurements taken after each storm, the original subdivision grading plans, and the approved design restoring runoff to its natural drainage route. He reviewed every page carefully before asking one question that immediately caught my attention. He wanted to know whether the decorative landscaping beside the entrance road had been added after the subdivision was originally built. I handed him the historical grading plans highlighting the original drainage swale. He studied the drawings for several moments, thanked me for keeping such detailed records, and returned outside carrying copies of several documents. Less than an hour later, additional county staff arrived. Survey flags appeared along sections of the landscaped common area, while elevation measurements continued throughout the afternoon. Linda Whitmore and several HOA board members stood nearby watching the inspection with noticeably less confidence than I had ever seen during board meetings. Nobody raised their voice. Nobody argued. The engineers simply continued collecting information, allowing measurements and records to speak for themselves. Late that afternoon, Harold stopped by once again. He leaned against my fence and quietly laughed as he watched another survey crew compare current elevations against archived county plans. He told me he had lived in the neighborhood long enough to remember when rainwater flowed through the original swale without pooling anywhere near the entrance road. According to him, the landscaping project had been promoted years earlier as a cosmetic improvement to increase property values. Nobody had considered how partially filling the drainage corridor would affect years of accumulated snow disposal. Convenience had slowly replaced engineering, and nobody noticed until enough small decisions finally connected together. 2 days later, every homeowner received an official notice announcing a special HOA meeting to discuss winter maintenance procedures, drainage concerns, and ongoing county recommendations. That wording alone revealed how dramatically the situation had changed. Only a few weeks earlier, my concerns had been dismissed as little more than complaints about snow on private property. Now the discussion included infrastructure, engineering, and official recommendations. During the meeting, the county engineer presented a straightforward summary supported by maps, photographs, and elevation data. The investigation concluded that my retaining structure complied with county requirements and functioned exactly as approved. The more significant finding involved years of snow being repeatedly deposited onto private property, combined with alterations to the original drainage corridor that reduced its ability to handle seasonal runoff. The room fell completely silent as those conclusions were read aloud. Nobody looked toward me. Instead, nearly every homeowner turned toward the HOA board. Linda remained composed, but the certainty that had once defined every answer was gone. She slowly closed the folder in front of her and admitted that the board would need to review both the snow removal contract and previous landscaping decisions with legal and engineering consultants. Sitting quietly near the back of the room, I realized I had never needed to defeat anyone. I only needed enough patience to let facts accumulate the same way winter had accumulated snow, one layer at a time, until the truth became too large for anyone to push on as somebody else's property. Over the next several weeks, the conversation inside the neighborhood changed more than it had during the previous 10 years combined. Instead of debating whether someone had overreacted to a few piles of snow, homeowners began asking for copies of engineering reports, maintenance invoices, and past board approvals. The county inspection had not assigned blame with dramatic speeches or emotional conclusions. It simply connected measurements, permits, historical grading plans, weather records, and photographs into one clear timeline that nobody could easily dispute. Facts have a quiet way of reshaping opinions, especially when every document supports the one before it. A second special HOA meeting was scheduled in the clubhouse on a cold Thursday evening. This time, nearly every chair was occupied before the meeting even began. I recognized neighbors who had never attended a board meeting in all the years I had lived there. Harold sat near the front with a notebook on his lap. The elderly couple from 2 streets over carried photographs showing repeated winter damage to the fence they had replaced years earlier. Another homeowner brought invoices documenting landscape repairs after seasonal runoff flooded part of his yard. One by one, stories that had always sounded like isolated inconveniences suddenly formed a pattern stretching back across multiple winters. The HOA's attorney opened the meeting by summarizing the county findings. He explained that my retaining structure complied with every applicable requirement, remained entirely within my property boundaries, and restored runoff to its documented natural drainage path. The more significant concern involved long-standing snow removal practices that relied on depositing excess snow onto private property rather than transporting it to designated storage areas. Combined with previous landscaping modifications that reduced the effectiveness of the original drainage corridor, those practices increased the likelihood of seasonal runoff collecting in unintended locations. Nobody interrupted him. There was no reason to. Every conclusion was supported by permits, surveys, inspection notes, and engineering records available for everyone to review. Linda Whitmore stood and addressed the room after the attorney finished speaking. Her tone was noticeably different from every previous meeting. She acknowledged that the board had relied too heavily on contractor routines without fully evaluating their long-term effects. She admitted that repeated complaints should have prompted a technical review much earlier, instead of informal assurances that everything would simply melt away. Although her words could not change what had happened, they marked the first time I had heard genuine accountability replace confident dismissal. The board then announced several immediate actions. The existing snow removal contract would be terminated at the end of the season. A new contractor would be selected through a competitive review requiring documented disposal procedures instead of informal practices. The landscape common area would be redesigned under the guidance of licensed engineers to restore the original drainage capacity as closely as practical. Homeowners who had documented property damage related to repeated snow disposal or runoff would be invited to submit claims for independent evaluation. Finally, the board approved a policy requiring every future infrastructure project affecting drainage to undergo professional engineering review before construction. As each motion passed, I noticed something remarkable. Nobody applauded. Nobody celebrated. The room remained calm because this was never about defeating another person. It was about correcting a system that had slowly drifted away from common sense until ordinary problems became accepted as normal. After the meeting, several neighbors walked over to thank me for keeping records instead of giving up. I told every one of them the same thing. The notebook alone had never solved anything. The permit alone had never solved anything. The retaining wall alone had never solved anything. What mattered was putting facts in the right order and allowing them to speak before emotions did. A few days later, I received a letter from the HOA confirming reimbursement for repairing the section of fencing damaged by repeated snow accumulation and acknowledging that future snow removal operations would remain entirely off my property unless I provided written permission. The amount itself was not life-changing, but the letter represented something far more valuable than money. It officially recognized that my property had been used in a way it never should have been. As winter slowly surrendered to early spring, the towering piles of snow finally disappeared from my yard for the first time in months. Fresh grass began appearing along the edge of the retaining wall, and small streams of clear water continued flowing quietly through the restored drainage path exactly as they were designed to do. Standing there one cool morning, listening to birds replace the sound of snowplows, I realized the greatest victory had never been watching ice cover a roadway. The real victory was watching an entire community rediscover that lasting solutions begin with responsibility, not convenience, and that even the smallest decision repeated year after year will eventually shape the place every neighbor calls home. By the time the following winter arrived, the neighborhood no longer looked or sounded like the place I had quietly endured the year before. The first major storm covered the rooftops, sidewalks, and pine trees with fresh white snow, but something important had changed long before the first snowflake reached the ground. During the summer, licensed engineers restored the original drainage corridor as closely as modern regulations allowed. The decorative landscaping that had blocked the natural flow of water was redesigned instead of simply removed, proving that appearance and good engineering could exist together when people were willing to respect both. The HOA hired a new snow removal contractor whose agreement required excess snow to be transported to approved storage areas instead of being pushed onto private property. Every operator received detailed maps showing property boundaries before the season even began. It was a simple change, but it reflected a completely different attitude. The goal was no longer convenience at any cost. The goal was doing the job correctly the first time. On the morning after the season's first heavy snowfall, I woke to the familiar sound of diesel engines outside. For a brief moment, I found myself expecting the same heavy crash that had become part of my routine the previous winter. Instead, I heard the steady movement of equipment continuing past my driveway without stopping. When I stepped outside with a cup of coffee, my mailbox remained visible, my fence stood untouched, and my front yard lay beneath an even blanket of clean snow exactly as nature had placed it. Farther down the road, I watched the contractor carefully load excess snow into hauling trucks instead of pushing it toward anyone's property. One of the drivers noticed me watching and raised a friendly hand before continuing his route. That small gesture carried more meaning than he probably realized. Respect had quietly replaced habit. A few weeks later, I ran into Linda Whitmore while checking my mailbox. She was no longer serving as HOA president after choosing not to seek another term during the board elections held that autumn. She greeted me with a calm smile that felt genuine rather than rehearsed. We stood together for a few minutes talking about the unusually cold forecast and the improvements made throughout the neighborhood over the summer. Before leaving, she paused and said something I never expected to hear. She thanked me for refusing to let the issue become a personal fight. She admitted that she had spent months believing every complaint represented another disagreement that would eventually disappear on its own. Looking back, she realized the real mistake had been confusing patience with surrender. I told her I had never wanted an argument. I had simply wanted the property my father left me to be treated with the same respect every homeowner deserved. She nodded quietly before wishing me a good winter and walking home. That conversation ended more peacefully than I ever imagined possible. Not because either of us suddenly agreed about everything, but because the truth had already done the difficult work that emotions never could. As spring returned once again, I found myself standing beside the retaining wall that had started so many conversations. Fresh green grass surrounded the stonework, and young wildflowers had begun growing along the edge where frozen piles of snow once towered above my fence. Birds filled the morning air with songs that had been drowned out by snowplows only a year earlier. I opened my father's old notebook one final time and slowly turned through every page. There were measurements, weather reports, sketches, photographs, and careful observations covering an entire winter. Those pages reminded me that solving difficult problems rarely begins with dramatic moments. More often it begins with paying attention while everyone else is looking away. I closed the notebook, placed it on the shelf in my workshop, and realized I would probably never need to add another entry. The wall remained exactly where I built it, not as a monument to revenge, but as a quiet reminder that preparation will always outlast frustration. Looking across the neighborhood, I saw children building snowmen, neighbors helping one another clear driveways, and trucks following routes that respected every property line. Nothing about the scene seemed extraordinary. Yet that ordinary morning represented the outcome I had hoped for from the very beginning. Nobody had to lose for the community to become stronger. Nobody needed to be humiliated for better decisions to replace old habits. Winter would always return. Snow would always melt. Water would always follow gravity. Those truths could never be changed. What people could change was whether they chose to work with those realities or pretend they did not exist. My father used to tell me that the strongest foundations are the ones nobody notices because they quietly carry everything above them without asking for recognition. Standing there beneath a bright blue Colorado sky, I finally understood exactly what he meant. Justice is not always loud. Sometimes it arrives one careful note, one honest measurement, one patient decision, and one simple act of responsibility at a time until the truth becomes impossible to bury beneath even the deepest snow.